right. Thank you, everyone, for coming to our session today. So we're going to be talking about cloud-native engineering and AI. And so the whole idea of this is we just want to have an open conversation with you, the audience, and ourselves about hot topics in this area. So I'm going to get started and introduce myself, and then we'll have the panel introduce themselves after that. But if at any point you have a burning question you want us to answer, just raise your hand, we'll bring a mic over, and we'll go from there. So anyways, I'm Amy. I work at Docker. I'm in product there. I manage our software supply chain solution, Scout, our trusted content programs, and our Docker extensions. So that's kind of me. Prior to that, health tech, fun, highly regulated products, and marketing tech. Interesting, I'll tell you that. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to the panel.
Hey everyone, I'm Efroni. I'm CEO and co-founder of Flox, and also the board member at the NixOS Foundation, a pretty large open source project. And at Flox, we kind of dive into the realm of environments and that realm of Nix, but in the enterprise context. And I'm very excited to be here.
Hi everyone, my name is Farid Zakaria. I'm a father of 3. I'm an engineering manager at Google on the Looker business intelligence platform team. And I am a PhD student looking into new binary formats. If that interests you, please talk to me after.
Hey everyone, my name is Beyang. Oh, sorry, talk a little bit further away from the mic. My name is Beyang. I'm the CTO, co-founder of Sourcegraph. We build a code search engine, and we're also makers of Cody, an AI coding assistant, which you can kind of think of as a combination of Copilot and ChatGPT, but with the context of your code base. So it can actually go in and mimic the patterns that are in your private code as opposed to the average or median of what's on Stack Overflow and open source.
Hey everyone, I'm Shreya. I am the co-founder and CEO of Gaurdrails AI. We focus on AI safety, reliability, and robustness, making sure that if you're building applications with generative AI, you have the guarantees and SLAs that you're used to with traditional software. In the past, I've worked on a number of projects in machine learning, including self-driving cars, machine learning infra, et cetera. Really excited to be here.
All right, thank you, everyone. So I am going to kick it off with one question, and we'll see where this goes. So you've all been building open source and dev tools for quite some time. What do you think is the first thing that's going to change with the widespread adoption of AI and engineering?
I can kick off. I feel slight concern. I feel that open source, to me, I'm personally very passionate about it. So I feel like that was really the way we move together as a group of humans doing awesome things. And I think that AI coming into it, the slight concern that I have is, yes, there's a lot of benefits, and I'm happy to talk about them. I'm sure some of the folks here would also want to talk about them. But what I feel is important to me is, how do we not position AI in a way that it makes it feel like we're leveraging contributions from all of our open source communities, if that can make sense, right? Is there a license question? Is there a culture question? Is there just an understanding between us, the contributors and the open source communities, and the companies and the entities running AI, learning off of it? So I think that's one of my many concerns.
Awesome. Anybody else on the panel want to chime in?
Yeah, so I second that. I think there's a lot of concerns to address about how this impacts the open source ecosystem and giving credit to where it's due in terms of open source contributions. But I also want to say, I'm very optimistic about the initial impact. I think for me personally, the impact of AI in code has been first and foremost eliminating things that I would rather not do in my workflow. So I've gotten into the habit of letting AI write more of the functions that are kind of like boilerplate, or oh, I know that's already been written somewhere else before, or this is kind of like a straight up pattern matching. It's similar to this other function, but you can kind of turn your brain half off while you're writing it, that sort of thing. And I imagine a bunch of you too, if you're using a lot of the AI tools available, you've discovered this ability where it's the more like toilsome programming tasks you can kind of now offload to a glorified autocompleter that does a pretty decent job of writing the stuff that's like more boring or more tedious to do in your workflow.
I definitely second that. I think I was just contributing to a few open source projects pretty recently, and I think there's a lot of ways I've been leveraging AI that I haven't been thinking about it recently since all the hype and focus on it. One was I was just having it generate release notes. That's pretty integrated into GitHub now. I had to generate the GitHub actions, so just like speaking to reducing all that toil, have me focus. We talked about this in the keynote, like focus on thinking through the problems instead of that toil. So yeah.
I guess like one more. I agree with the concerns. I do think that we should give, creators should be credited whose code we're using for training a lot of these AI models. But I also think in some sense, the coming wave of generative AI has democratized access to technology. It's almost like leading, the frontier in terms of what's like tools and possibilities, et cetera, come to the open source much sooner than they come to like enterprise features. I keep my favorite anecdote from this is back in 2020 when GPT-3 was released for the first time, there was a bunch of demos that happened on the open source about like auto-generating code. I'm sure you remember this, Beyang. Auto-generating like React code from a text description, which I think was very novel at the time. And my personal suspicion is that the OpenAI team was not thinking about this because like Codex, et cetera, came like much later. And thinking about like how language models can be used to generate code like came from that exploration of the open source. So it's a very like symbiotic community because like so many people are working with this, which ends up kind of broadening the horizon of these like fantastic tools that we get on the market. So net, like, yeah, we do need to give credit where it's due, but it's also like very positive and like sparks the imagination of like all of the builders that are building in this community.
Cool. All right.
One more thing I want to say is like, feel free to just interject, ask questions, raise your hand. We'd love this to be as interactive as possible and make it feel like we're all just grabbing beers.
Yeah.
Could we take like a quick straw poll of like the room, like what sort of AI tools are like? Oh, sorry. Could we do like a quick straw poll of like the room in terms of like what tools people are using today? Like how many people have incorporated ChatGPT in some fashion into their workflow, like used it to generate code? What about like completion-based tools like Cody or Copilot or Tab9? Okay, so like a bit less. Yeah, anyone like not incorporated any sort of AI tool into the workflow, like skeptical, like this is okay. So
I'm waiting for your questions.
Yeah.
That's cool. So I would say it's probably like maybe like an 80-20 split. You think that's fair? Yeah. Interesting.
All right. Any questions from the audience that we want to take? Otherwise, I've got a long list. It's a fun topic. All right. Yeah. Let's have a question over there.
I can also just talk loud. Any luck? Okay, awesome. My understanding of how these AI tools work, the generative AI, is that they look at a sample set of stuff that's already been created and they try to make intelligent decisions based on what you query them for to give you what you want out of that. So as these tools proliferate and more people are using them to generate code, in the long term, are these, like I've heard concerns that these tools will start looking at their own output or each other's output to generate more results. So in the long term, where's the creativity going to come from that gives these tools more access to new ideas so they can continue generating innovative results?
I think that's a great question. I think probably the not right term for it is like AI inbreeding there. I think this touches on a much, much wider scope of what even are we trying to achieve with AI, and what are we kind of letting AI do for us, right? And I think that what I'm hearing from you is, how are we training the AI at the meta level, right? What is that AI's personality? Is it prioritizing human feedback? Is it prioritizing AI feedback? And I think that's a whole question of its own. from my view, I think that's one of the challenges today with AI, figuring out what kind of data, right? Because to your point, right now we're on X amount of data, which is insane. With AI, we're going to be creating probably like X at, the power of X data in 10 years. How do we go about that? What's right, what's wrong, and how do we minimize the amount of inaccuracies coming out of it? Is something that I'd love to look into and see if others have thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to add some interesting anecdotes. So I think a lot of use of LLMs have been generating the boilerplate stuff, which we just talked about. That's been really interesting and useful. But I have been having an existential crisis. I've been using it through my PhD research to expand the boundary. I'm asking questions for things I know don't exist. That's the whole premise of a PhD. It's like add something novel and new. And I'm getting back occasionally, not all the time, and this is another problem we could talk about. You're relying on a tool that's in the cloud, so there is some knob, and I find it frustrating not to get the same type of quality consistently, but it is giving me back creativity. And that's interesting. Like, there is no prior art for which, it's not like a Stack Overflow post that it's consumed and fed back to me. I know it's novel content, and it's been really insightful. So it's going to be generating not new content. I think part of your question is we'll just be adding more potentially to the same 10,000 Fibonacci functions, slightly different. But I think there's another direction where we're going to expand the knowledge and the knowledge base here, which is it's more exciting.
I think piggybacking on that, so I have two answers to that question of how is this going to impact creativity. One is if all AI did was write code that's purely non-creative, kind of like the brain dead, tedious, oh, I just read this off Stack Overflow, I'm going to kind of pattern match it into my current file. That would be great. I feel like I spend 80% of my time writing code like that, where I turn my brain half off and just oh, all right, I got to do this to get to the fun part of the job. And so if I'm able to automate that part, it just means I get to spend more of my time on the truly creative tasks. And then my second answer would be, when you actually think about the creative part of the job, I think to your point, Farid, generative AI has shown itself to be kind of a useful tool to explore maybe the state space. I think the way to think about it is it's a combination of interpolation, so interpolating between the existing code that was in the training set, plus entropy. And I think there's an interesting question we could ask ourselves, how much of what we call creativity today is just interpolating between examples that we've seen before, plus a little bit of entropy, plus a little bit of randomness. I don't think it's all that. I think there is a form of creativity where it's okay, you're truly pushing the frontiers of knowledge. This is not just a kind of pattern matching against previous examples. And to me, that's both probably a minority of the things that we call creativity right now, but also the things that are truly differentiating. And if we can all spend more of our times as humans on that interesting part of the job, then I would call that a success. Make my life a lot more interesting. It would mean we could actually make much faster progress in terms of advancing the frontiers of human knowledge as encoded in code.
Yeah, this is a topic that I have opinions on. I think so, to your question, there was this article recently where ChatGPT makes it so easy to answer any engineering question that Stack Overflow now is flooded with these low-quality ChatGPT generated responses, which diminishes the overall, corpus of knowledge on the internet, because ChatGPT and all of these AI systems are also then trained on the internet, right? So you're kind of creating this feedback loop where you're feeding it lower quality knowledge over time, and so the quality of these AI systems, it's possible that over time the quality of these AI systems go down, and that's one common viewpoint. My personal viewpoint, though, differs from this a little bit, because AI systems are not the only tools that are creating knowledge, right? You basically, all of us use these AI tools similar to how we like brainstorm with like really smart colleagues, and knowledge and creativity occurs in like the space in between. Like it's like back and forth conversations, and like that triggers like imagination, right? And that kind of like increases our net new knowledge. So it's all about like how we're playing around with and like guiding these AI tools to generate, and to come to our aid and to augment our capabilities rather than be the only source of knowledge from which like any content is generated, right? I think the more real risk I see is just spam and low quality content becoming way more common. Like I've looked at like, one of my friends is a professor at UCLA, and every summer, you get like a lot of emails from like undergrads talking about like research internships. And he says that this year, the quality of emails like overall seems very higher, and they seem to understand his research. When he plugged in his page onto ChatGPT and is like, okay, yeah, write me like an email, and it, generated something that was very, very similar to his own email. So I feel like spam is going to get like much more sophisticated and much more tailored, which is not great.
Yeah, I think even in my thing, like, my biggest risk I see there is the bias that we can create. We are responsible for creating the data sets that feed these models, and there are things that don't happen in a way that's easy to collect data. And so I think that's a risk of the creativity, is like these ideas, like we're talking about, these conversations, they're not captured in these data sets and the ideas that we're coming up with. So I think even when it gets to creative, we're going to get creative of how we feed the models. Like, where is that creativity? Like, what do we do? There's a whole population of people that aren't online, like whether they don't have access to it or even just in their jobs, they're restricted because of the type of software development that they're doing. They can't go online. They're in air-gapped environments. How do we get that knowledge accessible to everyone as well as there's a lot of data out there. It takes some time to process. There's a lag. So we're going to have to stay ahead of it as well. Got a few questions, so.
Hi, I have kind of two questions, a little bit related. The first is one about fairness. What happens right now if I show up to a negotiation or a job interview or some sort of human interaction, but now I'm augmented, and I'm augmented by a 10 trillion weight model, and everyone else is only augmented by a 3 trillion weight one, and like, what does that mean in terms of what we can expect? And then the other question, I like the idea about spam. Well, once you start having the AI also now, maybe the bigger AI is responsible for identifying that spam. Now we have an interesting arms race. So just thoughts on those two.
All right, who wants to go first? It's a fun question, or fun questions.
I guess to the first question, it's like fairness. Like if you're in a job interview, for example, and you're writing a code sample, I think your question gets at like, if I'm using ChatGPT to write a bunch of the code for the assignment, is that like fair versus like someone who doesn't have access to it? And I don't know. Like I think this is an interesting question. Personally, I feel like ChatGPT or whatever AI tool that you use, it's just gonna be like using Google, right? Like if you're able to use Google and search for stuff, for code examples, like that is a bit of an unfair advantage. It is also something that all of us do every single day on the job, and that's just part of the professional skill set now. It's knowing how to search for stuff and quickly deliver results. So I think it's all fair game. Just use whatever tools are available on the market, and that's part of that holistic set of skills is part of your value as like a software engineer or a person who produces software.
I would say that I definitely feel concerned there, right? If this is going to cause more of a wider chasm between people, or would it bring them together? Here I am hopefully not naively hopeful. And I do hope that because of the accessibility to AI, the accessibility to ChatGPT, where you can pretty much run it on low-tech, low-cost hardware, as long as you're connected to the internet, while that still is not the entire world, will give folks the access to that, and will bring up those folks to a more fair level, because even today we have that differentiation.
Yeah, I think some of the work we're doing even at Docker to make the Gen AI stack accessible is really aimed at that and making sure that there's some fairness happening. We don't want it to have to take you to be an advanced engineer further in your career to figure out how to even set up a stack that you can run low cost for yourself. And so I think that's an important point. And like as a community, we need to make sure that we continue to keep the technology accessible to everyone.
I guess on fairness, there's also the flip side of this argument, right? Whereas there's so many implicit biases, where if you receive an email that's super well written versus an email that's, maybe the English is broken or the grammar isn't great, etc. Like you respond to those emails differently, or you receive those emails differently. I remember very early on ChatGPT release, somebody made an application for their landscaper who was an immigrant and did not have great English to kind of, anytime they would write an email, that email would first pass through, ChatGPT, which would rewrite it in a much more like, in a manner that was much more acceptable to an American audience. And that meant that, that person's like outbound emails ended up receiving, way better responses, like a higher response rate, right? So I think it's all about like how we as a society kind of use the tools. It is to some degree like a leveling, like because it's so easily accessible, like it does level the playing field for people in a pretty substantial way as well. And I think it's all about, how we configure it, how we use it, et cetera.
And also quickly a counterpoint to myself, which I was just thinking about, is what languages can you speak to ChatGPT in? Right, on the fairness accessibility question, it's not a big poll or, we can do it, but right now I'm pretty sure it's quite limited.
I think what gives me optimism, and I'm not an AI researcher, but so just on the fringe watching it, is we seem to be converging on how to get better quality with smaller models. So the analog I draw is something like a smartphone. Eventually we're going to have the capability where it's kind of like democratized. We all have equivalent. Someone with more money might not, the difference between a medium grade phone and like the iPhone Pro, whatever, max 10,000, is, in my opinion, marginal. Slightly better photographs, but it's pretty minimal. Tech doesn't always go that way, but I'm optimistic based on where I see the direction of research going, that it's headed in this direction.
Very quickly, I think you had another question as well, which is like, how do we respond to this now much more sophisticated level of spam? I think that is one area where that makes me pretty nervous. There was, some companies that were started on pretty early in the ChatGPT era, which would claim to classify text as either being AI generated or being human generated. And I think like those companies, like OpenAI had an endpoint to do that. And I think that endpoint, they ended up kind of sunsetting it because, I don't think we've quite like scienced it yet about how do we actually classify those outputs right now. So I think that's like a more worrying thing for me right now. And I think the other questions, we can kind of figure out.
I think also specifically in the domain of code, like the spam results that you can get are of the form like it generates code that looks plausible but is actually incorrect in a subtle way, or maybe it introduces a vulnerability that's very subtle into your code base. And I think the solution there is we need better guardrails, essentially what your company does, and some of the things that we're working on in the domain of code with Cody, which is essentially like combining generative AI with fact-checking devices that can either use AI themselves, or maybe they use more formal methods. Like compilers, great form of intelligence. There was a time where AI meant both kind of like statistical AI and kind of formal methods like context-free grammars and compilers and things like that. And I think the precise checking that you get with static analysis tools, these tools that we're all accustomed to using can be really great things to incorporate into this feedback loop where maybe you're using a transformer-based model to propose changes, but then you kind of like verify that they're correct by generating a unit test or feeding those into a compiler and then feeding that back into the language model to kind of like get it to the point where it converges on something that's correct, secure, and reliable.
So ecosystems that support formal verification will benefit the most?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's going to be a huge kind of like downstream demand for this sort of system. Like if you believe way more text is going to be AI generated, you believe way more code is going to be AI generated, then God help us. Like we need something that will verify the correctness and reliability of that code. It's hard enough to review code that was written by a human or code that you wrote, a couple months back. Now imagine like 10x, 100x the amount of code that was written by a robot that has no sort of like accountability to the correctness of that code. I think there's going to be a huge market for tools that essentially verify that AI generated, whatever meets some sort of quality bar or some compliance bar or something like that.
Yeah, so we've got some questions. I think there's one behind the poll. There's one over here. We'll try to get to everyone, but.
Okay, yeah. So I wanted to try to ask a little bit more about like AI in the cloud, specifically around like new DevOps practices. Because I feel like, and yeah, Ron's smiling because Nick's obviously, but yeah. So you have like a package or a Docker container or whatever, and you actually like need to deploy it. The way I've incorporated AI into that workflow is essentially writing assistance over like Terraform, right? But as you guys probably know, LLMs are stochastic. Terraform's not as stochastic, it's still a little bit stochastic, right? So my question is sort of like, it seems like it's not at a stage yet where you can have like agents go through and like deploy stuff out. So do you guys know of any like companies like working on that problem, trying to like instrument like DevOps lifecycles through AI? Like what's the state of the art there? Where do you think that's going?
I want to touch on a few things that you mentioned. I think you mentioned, I think, some of the biggest challenges I feel we have in AI today to progress it from what I view as human assisting to human replacing, right? The biggest impact from AI is going to come from the fact that you can trust it, right? And you can do other things. If that's in the DevOps flow, if you can just be like, here's what I need, and then it's going to happen. I think one of the challenges there is pretty much the reproducibility of AI. And I think this was partially mentioned also here in a few different contexts, where AI not being reproducible, right, or potentially even, I don't know if creativity has to do with it, is kind of an organic nature of what we try to build there, right? When we do it for art or for an email, the lack of reproducibility is fine. Art, it's maybe even encouraged. When we bring AI into software, security, DevOps, we don't want that. At least in 90% of cases. I'm obviously being highly opinionated, but we don't want that lack of reproducibility. I want engineer A in my organization to ask our AI, whatever, for a DevOps flow. I want that same DevOps flow to be implemented when engineer C at a different org inside the organization asks for it, right? Now this goes deeper into the security aspects and not exposing vulnerabilities and just that lack of reproducibility. I can say personally that Flox and Nix, there's a lot of things that have been looking into in terms of how do we provide this baseline concept of principles around reproducibility, determinism, right? These whole concepts to leverage and empower AI to help it shift from just, hey, I'm using it as an assistant, to this is actually replacing things and allowing me to push forward. Right?
I agree with that. I think AI has kind of largely solved one of the main challenges that people experience with DevOps, which is like, I don't want to have to learn like the nth DSL to figure out how to like get this thing into production. It's like now I can just go to an AI coding assistant or ChatGPT and say like, hey, show me an example of like some HCL that does this, and it gives me kind of like a pretty good starting point. Like I don't have to read through a bunch of docs manually. I can kind of like pattern match against what outputs. Now, having solved that problem, now we have another problem, which is how do I actually verify the thing that it gave me is correct? And that's where I think guardrails and more formal verification mechanisms come into play, because you need something that will say like, hey, given this output, I can guarantee that at least it type checks, or at least it won't trigger some common errors. And I think the next phase of the evolution will be like ensuring more reliability by having that kind of like type checking phase. And then once you have that, you kind of have this kind of like closed loop where you can kind of say like, oh, I want this. It will produce output that's like that. It will check it. Perhaps there's like errors or warnings. It'll feed back in that loop, and it'll kind of keep iterating until it converges on something that at least meets the standards that have been set by your formal verification tools.
I think we put the bar unnecessarily too high. And it's a bit of bias we have on the machines that's unfair, because a human would have taken that task on and inevitably would have had a bug. That's why we write tests, yet we seem to expect these tools to produce near perfect code that wouldn't necessitate a test. In the case of DevOps, to make it hyper specific, I think we over focus on whether we need 8 or 9 machines, right? And lose sight of the forest on if you had a tool that could take you through a DevOps workflow and get you to a near perfect state, like a human writing a Terraform script, you don't know necessarily, they wrote it, but was that actually the intent, what they even wanted to write? Like, that's why you go through review cycle of Terraform. Someone has to go look at it. So, it is congruent. What they wrote is what you get. But if we shift left the thinking, it might not have been correct anyways. So I think we need to afford a little bit more fallibility to these tools, to tap more into what they can do for us. So, yeah.
I guess it's an interesting perspective, but also I disagree fundamentally with being.
Got to a disagreement on the panel points.
Yeah, the claws come out. Yeah, I think for example, I mentioned this earlier. I used to work in self-driving cars. By and large, we know that self-driving cars are safer than an average human driver. But an accident caused by a self-driving car still is perceived to be much worse. Like if a self-driving car kills a person, that's way worse than, an accident on the road from which a lot of people die, very frequently. And it's because the scale at which vulnerabilities in an algorithm, can be scaled up is much larger than a human, right? Like human mistakes are almost independent of each other. So if a human writes the wrong config file and that results in something, there's an implicit feedback loop. There's a social cost of getting this wrong, which doesn't quite exist with AI, right? My company's Gaurdrails, a lot of what we focus on is making AI safe, reliable, et cetera. And for people, for example, that are building chatbots where there's a substantial cost of getting the response wrong, even if human agents get a response wrong, it'll be a one-off agent on a one-off, conversation, whereas with an AI getting it wrong, very quickly, that can proliferate. That vulnerability can be exploited very substantially, right? So I do think that this difference in perception of AI mistakes versus human mistakes, that's 100% real. But I think that also is to me somewhat justifiable for making sure that we're inching towards a more safer future rather than where vulnerabilities explode all of a sudden.
Yeah, I think just to chime in there, because I also very much agree with this, coming from health tech, the software, the applications running really impacts someone's lives. If, for example, I worked on something that helped people understand if they're going to have an asthma attack. If that didn't go right, the stakes are high. I don't have my inhaler on me. Can I breathe? Is there an emergency room around? And so I think we really need to be very cautious, just like we do as humans, in where we deploy this code and how it's tested and verified, because it could really impact someone's lives. But I think there's also the low risk things, like my shopping site goes down. Very tragic for the business, not so tragic for human life. So I think we really need to keep that in account when we're doing this and very much think about the stakes as they are the same as human. And it's really hard to do that with a machine versus having that outside perspective. I know you've had a question, but there's a question in blue shirt. Oh, over here as well, too. Yeah, we'll try to get both.
Sure, I'll try to be quick. This is actually probably more of a pile-on than a question anyway, just given where this has all gone. I'm curious what you guys think about just maybe the bigger picture implications to workflows. You started to get into it in the last question, but we don't all spend a lot of time interrogating our compilers, right? You trust a compiler to do something with your code that's very deterministic. That's obviously not what these things do, but the advantage of figuring out how to use these things to produce stuff is so large that aren't we just going to end up producing a whole new ecosystem of stuff around LLMs to bulletproof the code and push on it? And we'll all be spending time on that instead of on writing the actual code. That feels like the biggest shift that we're not quite making is if it passes the tests, and there might be a ton of tests, does it really matter what the code looks like, right? I think we're getting to the point where that's going to be true, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. AI-generated code will probably look different from the human kind of handcrafted code, the artisanal code that we write today. And I think, ultimately in the limit, it will change the whole way that software is developed. I mean, you probably kind of have to rethink the entire SDLC maybe from first principles, given that we have these tools of automation now. Now, that being said, I think we're still a ways away from kind of full automation, given where AI is today in terms of reliability and robustness. And the analogy that we like to draw is actually one to the kind of like self-driving world, where there's these kind of like different levels of automation. So like in self-driving, it's like, level 0 is you got nothing. Level 1 is like lane keep assist and cruise control. And 2 is like lane changing on highways. And then 3, maybe you do it in like city streets. And then 4 is like bad weather and like sort of the long tail of edge cases. And I think with Code AI, I think we're still at like level 1 right now. Level 1, I would say, is kind of like this kind of like inline completion use case where you're typing stuff, you're still manually writing the code, but it's just trying to complete your sentence or complete the function that you're writing. And that plugs into a specific part of the software development lifecycle. And then the next level up is a bit more automation. Rather than just like requiring you to start typing code to complete it, maybe you can describe a little bit more high-levelly what you want to do. Like, I want to do this, and now it will suggest here are the functions you should add, here's the unit tests that you should add. And so starting at these points in the life cycle, the automation will kind of grow from there. And then at some point, level 3 or 4, actually, the nature of this life cycle looks a lot different now, and maybe we have to revisit some of the baseline assumptions that we have.
I would also add to that point that for me, if I had to really bring it into just a few words in terms of how I feel about it, is where can we minimize human review? The SDLC is huge, right? And I think we touched on a few points here, going from just even incepting what the hell we even want to talk about or what we want to even build, all the way to production, to testing, to deploying, right? There's like a huge, huge line of items going across it. And I think for each section, there's going to be a big question of how much do we actually need to review this? To your point, we don't really review the compiler today, right? But there are areas that we can probably stop reviewing quite quickly and have that more of an iterative motion. I think Beyang mentioned like writing docs, right? Oh, here's a blob of code. Make sense out of it in human words and post that, right? Might not need to review it because if there's an issue at some point, maybe one of the users will come back. It's a much lower risk area, right? But security, for instance, I think we're still very far out on the review column, but I think my core notion is how do we minimize human review needs in the prioritized areas, pretty much.
I also want to call out that reviewing code is way less fun than writing it. And so like that's actually an issue, right? Like if you have this tool that is just like can generate code at orders of magnitude higher volume, but then you got to review it and find like the new, like I've had experiences where I'm using like a completion tool and it generates code, looks right, and then there's like an off by 1 error somewhere in there, and then it takes like more time to identify the root cause because like, you go on and do other things, and then suddenly like all you're like, okay, what just happened? Like I don't have that kind of like record in my brain of like what was the most likely thing to have been wrong because like that part was taken over by the AI. So I think there is kind of this like uncanny valley that we might have to like cross in the near term when the reliability and the verification isn't quite there yet.
Yeah, and real quick, just to that point, there are parts of the life cycle that only exist because humans can, right? Like you can't build software if you don't give a human time and like the opportunity to absorb something before they then go and do their job. Yep. Right? So it's just a question of like, do you keep doing it because we're all humans and we think that's right? Or do you find places where you can just completely remove some of these steps?
All right, so I think we have time for one more question, and we'll do that, and then we'll wrap this up. But it's been great so far.
Thank you. So the first point in here, expanding a little bit on the security aspect, you all mentioned about all the database of things that AI is being based on. Do you fear about poisoning of this database? So people start to throw like malicious code and backdoors so that people can start using it. And just to expand a little bit on the point, sorry, I forgot your name, but you're mentioning about, yes, about the bad part that's basically be reviewing stuff. How long do you all think that's going to take for people and developers to become local developers and not like full stack?
Yeah, so I guess on the first point, are we worried about poisoning the training sets of these language models? I think that's a real risk. I think the way we think about it is, to what extent we need to retrain LLMs from scratch at this point? We already have foundation models that kind of capture the basic semantics of programming languages and human languages. And I think for us, at least, when we're thinking about building Cody, the next frontier is not, hey, how do we build an even larger training set to retrain the foundation model? It's how can we take a foundation model that already has the kind of structure of the language built in and fine tune it on, say, like a customer-specific code, or augment it with information retrieval mechanisms like code search to do this kind of like last mile, like here are the snippets that are most relevant in the code base that you're working on. And there's an interesting question there. Like, we've had customers come to us and say, like, hey, like, I don't want Cody to refer to all my code base because a lot of my code is not that great. Like, is there a way I can tell it, like, hey, here are the good parts of the code. Here's the one that, you know, our best engineers just and capture the stylistic conventions that we want to replicate across the whole code base. And that's something that we're working on now. And then what was your second question again?
Second question was about developers becoming local.
Oh, second question was developers about how long will how long will it take for developers to become low-code developers? I think in a way we're already. I am of two minds. One is we're already getting there. Like, the more we rely on AI tools to write code, the less code we are writing ourselves. At the same time, I don't think the source code is going anywhere. I think one of the limitations of traditional low-code tools is, like, once you reach the point of limitation where the abstractions can't capture what you're trying to do, you're screwed, right? Because, like, then you have to break the abstraction boundary, and then now you're writing code. I think the nice thing about AI is that, like, you can operate in kind of like a low-code way, but underneath the hood, you still have the source code that's generated, so it doesn't restrict you in the same way.
My take, and maybe this will be another panel disagreement, is I think there's a lot of focus on issues that have analogs to today, so they don't concern me. And I think one we talked about, you have to trust a compiler. There's a pretty famous talk called trusting trust. You have to draw the line somewhere. Ultimately, you're running on an ASIC. I don't verify the hardware I'm running on, so we're going to just, move that placement point likely further. So that part doesn't concern me. I'm more focused on and trying to think through what are the things that don't have analogs here, that I can't reason through. The other one, fairness, I see another analog. Everyone has a calculator when they do a test now. That hasn't changed how we do testing, for instance. So, yeah. That's a pretty short answer to say that it doesn't scare me, the poisoning.
Yeah, I think like data poisoning, especially, I like to call it like a third generation machine learning, which is very foundation model, large language model based. Previously, when a lot of companies were still training their own models, which is like a little bit less now, you would typically, like, data poisoning would end up being a huge concern. I think like now for most companies where the model itself is the commodity, there's this massive amount of investment that goes into like curating the right data sets and making sure that those data sets work. So a recent example is this this European foundation model company called Mistral, which, unlike other commercial foundation model companies, release their model weights as well. So they, you don't have like OpenAI model weights, but you do have like Mistral's foundation model weights. What they did not release was the data set that they used to train that model on, right? So that data set is still that's still the secret sauce, and there's like a huge investment that goes into making sure that the data set is correct. So compared to the previous generations of ML, where like smaller companies that did not have the resources to make sure that data poisoning was avoided, I actually think that like now that training is becoming more consolidated, that to me feels somewhat less of a concern. Yeah, I guess your other question, I agree with like a lot of what was said here. I don't think that like I don't think like I'm becoming a low-code programmer, but I do think like a lot of other people that did not know how to code now now have the ability to code by using foundation model chatbots or by using like coding assistants. I think that to me feels like the difference. As a programmer, you still need to kind of like understand the code that you're writing, but a lot more people can now write like rudimentary code, which might have felt really, really hard to get started with.
I'm going to say this in 15 seconds because I think we have 30 seconds left. I feel quite excited, and thank you for asking that question because I feel it wraps a lot of questions up together. I think that while we'll be able to focus less on the menial, the boring work of engineering, humanity will be able to move into the creative, interesting, bleeding edge work of engineering, and I'm really, really excited where we'll be in 10 years.
Yeah, so with that, I think we are out of time. I want to thank everyone here on the panel, as well as you in the audience for participating in this conversation. I think this is a topic that's going to be something we don't stop discussing for a long time. And I think we need to do it in the open. So I'd encourage everyone to start these conversations in your organizations, in online forums, because I think this is something as a community we're going to need to figure out. And there's no easy answer. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great day.